The 7 Years' War was the final in a series of imperial wars spanning 75 years that finally settled the colonial territorial conflicts between France, England, and a number of other parties. In doing so, it sealed the fate of the Native Americans, set the British colonists and military leaders on the road for the Revolutionary War, and removed the French influence in the Americas. The 7 Years' War was the conflict that forged the fate of a continent. Between the late 1680s and early 1800s, wars between France and England dominated European politics. 1688 saw the first of 4 intercolonial wars, beginning with the War of the League of Augsburg, known in the colonies as King William's War. 1702, 5 years after that war's conclusion, marked the beginning of the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War. In 1744, yet another war raged between European powers, the War of Austrian Succession, also known as King George's War. These 3 affairs were typical European dynastic conflicts of the time. The fighting was focused in the mother countries and revolved around monarchs dueling for their thrones. These wars, despite being fairly costly both in money and in lives, were quite indecisive. The final intercolonial war, the 7 Years' War, strayed from this norm. Sometimes considered to be an extension of the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War began in the back country of the New World with the Battle of Jumonville Glen. In this first skirmish, a young George Washington, along with his troops and the warriors of Seneca leader Half King, made their way through the woods of southwestern Pennsylvania, meeting with a French troop led by Commander Joseph Coulon de Villers, Sieur de Jumonville. The events that followed are relatively unclear. The Half-King's warriors trapped the Frenchmen in their own camp, with Englishmen firing all around the unprepared troop, who could do scarcely more than retreat to the woods and return a few desperate shots. By the evening of May 28, 1754, 4 Englishmen and 14 Frenchmen lay dead or wounded in the hollow, with the most notable casualty being the death of French commander Jumonville. From a small skirmish in the wooded back country of Pennsylvania, the war that forged North America had been set into action. Almost immediately after the battle that led to the death of his brother, Commander Louis Coulon de Villers left Fort Duquesne, on path to intercept Washington. Washington faced a tough decision, with his weary and ill troops making slow progress on the retreat from an impending attack from the French. He halted them at the site of an aptly named Fort Necessity, less than 10 miles away from the site of Jumonville Glen. A rainy July 3, 1754 morning brought 600 French and Canadian soldiers and 100 natives face to face with Washington's troops, who were unprotected by the hastily made fort. In the first and only surrender of his career, Washington requested terms, but could not read the French surrender document, which stated that Washington took responsibility for the murder of Jumonville, accepted that the Ohio was French territory, and agreed that the English would evacuate the area. Although neither Britain, nor France, nor the natives set out with the intention of being a part of a war over the Ohio country, all parties found themselves suddenly flung into a global war, a central theater of which became the back country of Pennsylvania and Virginia.
The land was valuable to both European nations. The English needed the land for the continuing spread of their population. They had 1.5 million people that were living in the 13 colonies at the time, and was doubling every 25 years. The conflict would come when these 2 great powers would meet in the Ohio River Valley. It's basically akin to children wanting the same toy, and that's what the Ohio River Valley was.
From here, the war branched into a worldwide conflict, continuing with a few more Virginia and Pennsylvania backcountry skirmishes such as Forbes's expedition and Boker's expeditions, before stretching into Nova Scotia, the Hudson River area, the Lake Ontario area, Minorca, Central Europe, Louisbourg, West Africa, Quebec, the Eastern Caribbean, the coast of France, the Upper Great Lakes, and a number of other places before the final battle. This was unique for the time period. In an era when most wars began in Europe and spread, usually in a fairly minor way, to the colonies, the reverse was the case for the 7 Years' War. In what was once referred to by Winston Churchill as the First World War, skirmishes in the back country of the New World led to a complete shift in the makeup of North America, with the end of the war marking almost complete French removal, both in politics and in physical presence. This, of course, did not settle the centuries-long conflicts between England and France. However, it did seal the fate of North American people. British colonists, inhabitants of New France, and, perhaps most notably, the Native Americans.
Literally, the signing of the peace treaty, of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, changed everything. The removal of the French from North America was a total game changer. Most American historians see it as the road to the revolution anyway, but for Native people, it was the beginning of a very difficult relationship.
Native peoples of the era had become increasingly reliant on both French and English trade goods, particularly guns and ammunition, and a lack of French trade goods, at first due to the intercolonial wars leading up to the 7 Years' War, and later because of the removal of the French from the colonies, caused great problems for the natives, who could no longer play the English and French off of one another when attaining such goods. Many tribes also faced great devastation after the war, with much of the fighting going on in their homelands of the Ohio River Valley. Tension between soldiers and natives was high, with one Frenchman stating in regards to native wartime traditions that "it is shameful for the human race to use such barbarous methods. Yet, to tell the truth, the idea belongs only to the savages, who were using it before they heard of civilized nations." Even after the 1763 signing of the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war in North America and redistributed land, widely in English favor, the 7 Years' War continued to have great impact. Internationally, the British became the new big empire, knocking France off of their perch. The North American continent saw similar shifts taken to a greater extreme. Other than in some language and culture, French influence was removed entirely, leaving the British to shape politics, customs, and culture in their newly acquired land. As the British found themselves gaining significant holdings of this previously French land in the New World, their responsibilities increased in ways that caused conflict with the colonial leaders, especially over the issue of geographic expansion. The war was extremely costly. Large military spending during the war led England into huge debt, forming the necessity of new taxes on colonists of the New World, and sparking the fire leading to the American Revolution. In addition to setting the stage for the American Revolutionary War, the 7 Years' War prepared both common soldiers and higher military personnel for revolt. Early battles like Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity offered a 23-year-old George Washington his first taste of war, with a young general stating early on that, "I heard the bullets whistle, and, believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Although he was by no means a hero of the first war in his career, the conflict was a starting point for young Washington, who rose to become a major leader of the American Revolutionary War. The 7 Years' War was also a starting point for militiamen of lesser status than Washington. Many who fought in the Revolutionary War were previously soldiers of the 7 Years' War, who had been trained for battle during their service in the backcountry of North America. But the impact of the war stretched farther than just the New World. It branched into much of Europe and as far as the Caribbean islands, West Africa, India, the East Indies, Argentina, and the Philippines. The 7 Years' War was one of the only examples of skirmishes beginning in the colonies and spreading into the mother countries, and then across the world. Although often neglected in textbook accounts of American history, the final imperial war, the 7 Years' War, was a turning point at every level of society. For major powerhouse countries like England and France, it offered a shift in power, a shift away from French culture and society in the New World, and towards British control in politics. For British and French colonists of North America, this shift of power shaped their life, their leaders, their loyalty, and their culture. For Native Americans, this shift of power marked the beginning of a rocky relationship between their new only North American neighbors, the British. For military men of all rankings, the war offered a first glimpse of battle and the glory that could go along with it. The first true world war in many senses, the 7 Years' War touched both the largest countries and the smallest islands, both the most influential cultures and the most overlooked tribes, both the kings and the colonists. The 7 Years' War was the conflict that forged the fate of a continent and beyond.